"You're just wasting space here, Maya." Those were the exact words my father, Richard Thompson, said to me in front of 30 relatives at our annual 4th of July barbecue in Phoenix, Arizona. Not whispered privately, not suggested gently, declared loudly enough for my cousins, aunts, uncles, and my successful siblings to hear every syllable. The reason? My younger brother Derek had just announced his promotion to senior partner at his prestigious law firm downtown. Everyone was raising their glasses, patting him on the back, congratulating the golden boy of the family. And there I was, 28 years old, standing by the pool table in a wrinkled blouse, holding a beer I'd barely touched, trying to blend into the background. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. "Derek's making real moves," Dad continued, his voice carrying that tone of disappointment I'd grown accustomed to. "Building something substantial. Not like some people who spend their days playing with computers and calling it work. Playing with computers. That's how he saw my life. That's how they all saw it." My sister Jessica, the marketing director at a Fortune 500 company, nodded in agreement. My mom, Patricia, looked away uncomfortably. Nobody defended me. Nobody asked what I was actually doing with those computers. I could have told them right then. I could have explained that my computer games had generated over $2 million in revenue in the past 18 months. I could have mentioned that my team of 12 remote developers was building software that Fortune 500 companies were literally fighting to license. I could have pulled out my phone and shown them the bank statements, the client contracts, the acquisition offers I'd been quietly declining. But I didn't. I just stood there, feeling the familiar burn of shame creep up my neck, and said the only thing that felt safe. "You're right, Dad. I should probably head out anyway." "Good idea," he replied, not even looking at me as he turned back to Derek's celebration. "Leave the party to people who actually have something to contribute." 5 days later, the most beautiful irony of my life would unfold. But that 4th of July evening, as I walked to my beat-up Honda Civic while the sounds of celebration continued behind me, I had no idea that everything was about to change. I had no idea that within a week, I'd be sitting across from my father in a conference room, watching him realize that the daughter he called a space waster had just become his boss. To understand how we got here, you need to know about the Thompson family dynamic that had been suffocating me for years. My father, Richard Thompson, built Thompson Manufacturing from nothing. Started in 1987 in a tiny warehouse in Tempe, making custom metal components for construction companies. By the time I was in high school, he employed 40 people and had government contracts worth millions. Richard Thompson was old school. Handshakes meant everything. Physical products were real business. Digital anything was just playing around on the internet. He wore the same style of button-down shirts every day, drove a pristine 2018 Ford F-150, and believed that success meant having something tangible you could touch, see, and sell. My brother Derek understood the assignment perfectly. Went to Arizona State for business, then law school at University of Arizona. Joined Crawford Martinez and Associates straight out of graduation. 3 years later, he was bringing in million-dollar clients and wearing $1,000 suits. When Derek walked into a room, Dad's chest puffed out with pride. "That's my boy," he'd tell anyone who'd listen. My sister Jessica took a different but equally acceptable path. Marketing degree from ASU, started at a small agency, worked her way up to marketing director at Pinnacle Industries. She understood brands, campaigns, traditional business metrics. Dad respected that. "Jessica gets it," he'd say. "She knows how to make companies money the right way." Then there was me, Maya, the family anomaly. While Derek was learning contract law and Jessica was studying consumer psychology, I was in my bedroom learning Python, JavaScript, and database architecture. While they were networking at professional events, I was on GitHub contributing to open-source projects and building web applications that solved real problems for real people. But none of that looked like success to Dad. When I dropped out of college after 2 years to focus full-time on freelance web development, the disappointment in his voice was unmistakable. "You're throwing your life away," he told me. "Computers are a hobby, not a career." When I moved into a small apartment instead of the house Derek bought, Dad saw failure. When I drove my paid-off Honda instead of leasing something new like Jessica, Dad saw lack of ambition. When I worked from home in jeans and t-shirts instead of commuting to an office in business attire, Dad saw someone who wasn't serious about life. The family gatherings became exercises in endurance. Every Christmas, every birthday, every holiday barbecue followed the same script. Derek would share news about his latest case victory or client acquisition. Jessica would talk about her marketing campaigns and team management. Then attention would turn to me and I'd mumble something vague about working on some projects, while Dad's expression grew more disappointed. "What kind of projects?" he'd ask, but in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't satisfy him. "Software development. Building applications for businesses." "Applications?" Dad would repeat the word like it left a bad taste. "What does that even mean?" I learned to keep my answers short, generic, and non-threatening. I never mentioned the clients who paid me $15,000 to build custom inventory management systems. I never talked about the startup founders who flew me to San Francisco for consulting sessions. I never brought up the recurring revenue from software licenses or the acquisition offers I was getting quarterly. Because in Dad's world, if it wasn't manufacturing something physical, managing people in an office, or practicing law, it wasn't real work. And if it wasn't real work, I wasn't a real success. And if I wasn't a real success, I was just wasting space at family gatherings, where accomplished people discussed important things. The worst part wasn't the disappointment. The worst part was that I'd started believing him. Despite the growing bank account, despite the client testimonials, despite the industry recognition I was quietly receiving, some part of me wondered if maybe Dad was right. Maybe I was just playing elaborate computer games while my siblings built real careers. That doubt was what kept me quiet for so long. That doubt was what made me endure gathering after gathering, criticism after criticism, without defending myself or revealing what I was actually building. But doubt, as I was about to learn, has a way of disappearing when reality comes knocking. That 4th of July barbecue wasn't just another family gathering. It was the moment everything crystallized. I'd been building my software company Nextflow Solutions for 3 years, but I'd kept it invisible to my family, not because I was ashamed, but because I'd learned that their definition of success was so narrow that anything outside it didn't register as real achievement. But that night, something shifted. Maybe it was the way Derek smirked when Dad made the wasting space comment. Maybe it was how Jessica actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but an actual laugh at my expense. Maybe it was watching my mom look away instead of defending me, choosing family peace over her son's dignity. As I drove home that night through the quiet Phoenix streets, my phone kept buzzing with notifications, not from family checking if I was okay. They were too busy celebrating Derek's success. The notifications were from my business. Client messages, server alerts, team updates from developers in Portland, Austin, and Atlanta, who were working on projects worth more than Derek's entire annual salary. I pulled into a gas station and just sat there for a moment, watching the messages flow in. Sarah Chen, my lead developer, was asking about the user interface specs for a project we were building for a medical device company. That project alone was worth $180,000. Mike Rodriguez, my business development guy, had forwarded 3 new client inquiries that had come in while I was at the barbecue. Each potential contract was larger than anything my sister managed in her marketing role. But the message that really got to me was from Rachel Kim, the CEO of a logistics startup in Seattle. She'd sent a simple text. "Marcus, the efficiency gains from your supply chain software are incredible. Our investors are asking if you'd consider letting them fund an expansion of the platform. Could be 8-figure territory if you're interested." 8 figures. I sat in that gas station parking lot, reading about 8-figure opportunities on my phone, while my family was back at the barbecue, convinced I was a failure because I didn't wear suits or work in a traditional office. When I finally got back to my apartment, not the house Derek had bought, not the condo Jessica owned, just a simple 2-bedroom apartment in Scottsdale, I made a decision. I wasn't going to family events anymore, not until they could see me as something other than the disappointment who played with computers. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't send a dramatic text or make a big proclamation. I just stopped showing up. When my mom called to invite me to Derek's birthday dinner 2 weeks later, I politely declined. When Jessica texted about a cousin's barbecue in August, I said I was busy with work. Work, she texted back, with a laughing emoji. That emoji burned, but instead of getting angry, I channeled that energy into something productive. I started working 16-hour days. Not because I was desperate or struggling, but because I finally had clarity about what I was building and why it mattered. Nextflow wasn't just a software company. It was proof that innovation could come from anywhere, that you didn't need corporate headquarters or traditional credentials to solve real problems for real businesses. Every line of code I wrote, every client meeting I took, every system I designed, was evidence that my father's definition of success was outdated and limiting. The isolation was strange at first. No more dreaded family dinners where I felt like I was defending my existence. No more gatherings where I had to pretend my accomplishments were somehow less valuable because they happened on computers instead of in conference rooms. Just me, my team, and the work that was quietly changing how mid-sized companies managed their operations. During those months of family silence, something beautiful happened. Without the constant noise of disappointment and criticism, I could hear my own voice again. I remembered why I'd started coding in the first place, not to prove anything to anyone, but because I loved solving problems and building systems that made life easier for people. And the business grew. Not slowly, not gradually, but exponentially. By September, we'd signed contracts worth over $800,000 in annual recurring revenue. By October, I was having conversations with acquisition firms who'd heard about our supply chain optimization software. By November, I was fielding calls from Fortune 500 companies who wanted to license our inventory management platform. But the most interesting call came on a Tuesday morning in December. It was from Janet Morrison, a mergers and acquisitions specialist in Scottsdale. She had a proposition that would change everything. "Marcus," she said, "I have a client who might be perfect for what you're building. They're a mid-sized manufacturing company that's struggling with outdated inventory systems. The owner is old school, resistant to digital transformation, but their board is pushing for modernization. Sound like something you'd be interested in?" I asked for more details. When she said the company name, I almost dropped my phone. Thompson Manufacturing, my father's company. The irony was so perfect it felt like the universe had been planning this moment for years. My father's company, the same business he'd built as proof that real work meant manufacturing physical products, was struggling because they'd refused to modernize their digital infrastructure. And the solution to their problems was sitting in the apartment of the son he'd dismissed as a space waster. But Janet Morrison didn't know I was Richard Thompson's son. To her, I was just Marcus Thompson, CEO of a rapidly growing software company that specialized in manufacturing optimization. The fact that I shared a last name with her client was just a coincidence she hadn't noticed. I should have told her right then. I should have explained the family connection and recused myself from the opportunity. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity about how bad their situation had really gotten. Maybe it was the business opportunity. Manufacturing companies were perfect clients for our supply chain software. Or maybe, if I'm being completely honest, it was the chance to see if my father would recognize value in what I'd built when he didn't know it was coming from me. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "Tell me more about their challenges," I said. Janet explained that Thompson Manufacturing had been family-owned and operated for over 30 years, but the founder was struggling to adapt to modern business practices. Their inventory management was still largely paper-based. Their supply chain logistics were inefficient. Their customer relationship management was practically non-existent. They were losing contracts to competitors who could provide real-time project updates and transparent communication. "The board wants to bring in outside consultants," she explained, "but the owner is resistant. He thinks digital solutions are too complicated and unreliable. We need someone who can demonstrate clear value quickly, someone who understands traditional manufacturing but can implement modern solutions." It was like she was describing my exact expertise. Nextflow had built inventory management systems for 12 manufacturing companies in the past 2 years. Our supply chain optimization software had helped clients reduce costs by an average of 23%, while improving delivery times by 31%. Our customer portal system had increased client satisfaction scores across the board. More importantly, I understood my father's business better than any outside consultant could. I'd grown up hearing about the challenges of coordinating multiple suppliers, managing seasonal demand fluctuations, and maintaining quality control across different product lines. I knew which aspects of the operation were essential to preserve and which were holding him back from growth. I'd like to learn more, I told Janet. But I have one condition. I want to present directly to the owner and his team, not just the board. If we're going to implement solutions, we need buy-in from leadership. She agreed to set up a meeting. As I hung up the phone, the full implications of what was happening began to sink in. In less than 6 months, I'd gone from being told I was wasting space at a family barbecue to being invited to save the family business. But Janet and my father didn't know that yet, and I wasn't sure I was going to tell them. Over the next 2 weeks, I prepared the most comprehensive business proposal of my career. I analyzed Thomson Manufacturing's public financial data, researched their competitors, and designed a complete digital transformation strategy that would address their most pressing challenges without overwhelming their existing operations. The proposal wasn't just about software implementation. It was a roadmap for bringing a traditional manufacturing company into the digital age while preserving the hands-on, quality-focused culture that had made them successful. I recommended starting with inventory management, then expanding to supply chain optimization, and finally implementing customer relationship tools that would give them a competitive advantage in bidding for new contracts. I calculated that these improvements could increase their operational efficiency by 35% and reduce their overhead costs by $180,000 annually. For a company of Thomson Manufacturing's size, those numbers represented the difference between steady decline and sustainable growth. But the most important part of my preparation wasn't technical, it was psychological. I had to decide how to handle the family connection. Should I reveal my identity up front, wait until after the presentation, let them discover it naturally? I decided to let the work speak first. If my father was going to see value in what I'd built, I wanted him to see it without the filter of family expectations or preconceptions. I wanted him to judge the proposal on its merits, not on his assumptions about his son's capabilities. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at Thomson Manufacturing's main office in Tempe. As I drove there in my Honda Civic, the same car Dad had seen as evidence of my lack of success, I felt a mix of nervous excitement and quiet vindication. I wasn't going there to prove my father wrong, or to get revenge for years of dismissal. I was going there to do what I'd always done: solve problems with technology and innovation. The fact that the problems belonged to the man who'd called me a space waster was just a beautiful coincidence. Or maybe it wasn't a coincidence at all. Maybe this was what happened when you spent years building something valuable, while everyone around you was too focused on traditional definitions of success to notice what was actually being created. As I pulled into the Thomson Manufacturing parking lot, the same lot I'd visited as a kid, watching Dad's pride in his growing business, I realized that everything was about to change. Not just for me, but for him too. He was about to learn that the son he'd dismissed had become the solution to his biggest problems. The Thomson Manufacturing conference room looked exactly like I remembered from the few times Dad had brought me to work as a kid. Same long wooden table, same motivational posters about teamwork and quality, same view of the warehouse floor where dozens of employees operated machinery that had made the Thomson name respected in the Arizona construction industry. But this time, I wasn't there as Richard Thompson's disappointing daughter. I was there as Maya Thompson, CEO of Nextflow Solutions, presenting a comprehensive digital transformation strategy to a struggling manufacturing company that happened to be owned by my father. Janet Morrison introduced me to the room, my father Richard, my uncle Steve, who served as operations manager, their accountant Patricia Walsh, and 2 board members I didn't recognize. Dad looked older than he had at the July barbecue. More tired, more stressed. The confident swagger I remembered from my childhood seemed diminished. Maya Thompson from Nextflow Solutions, Janet announced. They specialize in manufacturing optimization software and have an impressive track record with companies similar to yours. Dad glanced at me with mild interest, then returned to the folder in front of him. He didn't recognize me. Not because I looked different, but because in his mind, his daughter Maya couldn't possibly be the CEO of a software company successful enough to be recommended by a mergers and acquisitions firm. Thank you for the opportunity, I began, connecting my laptop to their projector. I've reviewed Thompson Manufacturing's operational challenges, and I believe we can implement solutions that will increase efficiency by 35% while reducing overhead costs by approximately $180,000 annually. That got their attention. Dad looked up from his folder, suddenly focused. I walked them through the presentation I'd spent 2 weeks perfecting. Real-time inventory management that would eliminate their chronic overstock and understock issues. Supply chain optimization that would reduce material costs and improve delivery schedules. Customer relationship management that would help them compete more effectively for large contracts. But I didn't just present abstract concepts. I showed them specific examples of how our software had transformed similar manufacturing companies. Miller Industries in Portland had reduced their inventory costs by 28% in the first year. Phoenix Metalworks had improved their on-time delivery rate from 73% to 96%. Southwest Manufacturing had increased their annual revenue by $340,000, while reducing their operational staff by 2 positions. These numbers seem too good to be true, Dad said, but his tone was more curious than skeptical. How do we know this isn't just sales presentation magic? I pulled out my phone and opened a live dashboard connected to Miller Industries' system. This is real-time data from one of our clients. You can see their current inventory levels, active orders, supplier delivery schedules, and production capacity, all updated automatically as their operations continue. The room went quiet. Uncle Steve leaned forward, studying the screen. You're telling me they can see everything happening in their business just by looking at their phone? Not just see it, I replied, predict it. The system uses historical data and current trends to forecast demand, optimize ordering schedules, and prevent problems before they become expensive mistakes. For the next hour, I answered every question they threw at me: technical questions about data security and system integration, financial questions about implementation costs and return on investment, operational questions about staff training and change management. I could see Dad's skepticism gradually transforming into genuine interest. This wasn't the computer games he'd dismissed for years. This was sophisticated business software that solved real problems he'd been struggling with for decades. The initial implementation would take approximately 6 weeks, I concluded. Total investment of $85,000 for the first year, which includes software licensing, system integration, staff training, and ongoing support. Based on our projections, you'll recover that investment within 8 months through efficiency gains and cost reductions. The board members exchanged glances. Patricia Walsh, the accountant, was already calculating numbers in her notebook. Uncle Steve was nodding slowly, clearly impressed by what he'd seen. But Dad was studying me more carefully now. Something in his expression had shifted from professional interest to puzzled recognition. Maya Thompson, he said slowly. Nextflow Solutions. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. You look familiar. Have we met before? This was the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading. I could have deflected, made up some story about meeting at a business conference or industry event, but I was tired of hiding who I was and what I'd accomplished. Yes, we've met, I said calmly. I'm your daughter. The conference room went completely silent. Dad's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and something that might have been shock. Maya, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My Maya, the one who plays with computers, I finished. The one who wastes space at family gatherings. The one who isn't building anything real or substantial. Uncle Steve's jaw dropped. Patricia Walsh looked back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match. The board members seemed frozen in their chairs. Dad stared at me for a long moment, then looked at the presentations still displayed on the screen behind me. You built this? This whole company? 3 years ago, I replied. Started with freelance web development. Now we have 12 employees, 32 active clients, and over $2 million in annual revenue. Last month, we turned down an acquisition offer for 8 figures because we're not ready to sell yet. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Finally, Dad spoke again, his voice shaky. You never told us. You never asked, I replied. Every time I mentioned software development, you called it playing with computers. Every time I talked about my work, you changed the subject to Derek's legal career or Jessica's marketing job, so I stopped talking about it. Dad looked around the room, suddenly aware that this family revelation was happening in front of his business associates and board members, but I wasn't done. The funny thing is, I continued, this meeting isn't about family, it's about business. Your business needs what my company provides, regardless of whether you approve of my career choices. The question is whether you're more interested in saving Thompson Manufacturing or maintaining the belief that traditional jobs are the only ones that matter. The aftermath of that conference room revelation unfolded over the following days like a slow-motion earthquake. Dad asked for a week to discuss the proposal with his team, but I knew he needed time to process the fact that his disappointment of a daughter had become the solution to his biggest business problems. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Mom. Maya, honey, your father told me about the meeting. I had no idea about your company, about any of it. Why didn't you tell us? I was sitting in my apartment office, reviewing code for a new client project. Mom, do you remember the last time I tried to explain what I do for work? There was a pause. You said you were building applications. And what did Dad say? Another pause. Longer this time. He said it sounded like computer games. Right, so I stopped trying to explain. I figured if you were interested in my success, you'd ask questions instead of dismissing it. Mom was quiet for a moment. Then, your father wants to meet with you again. Not at the office. Just the two of you. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Old Town Scottsdale, neutral territory, where we could talk without the weight of family history or business formality. Dad arrived first, looking uncomfortable in khakis and a polo shirt instead of his usual work uniform of button-downs and slacks. I've been thinking about what you said, he began before I'd even sat down, about me never asking about your work. I ordered coffee and waited. I'd learned that silence was often more powerful than words. The thing is, he continued, I didn't know how to ask. Your brother talks about cases and clients. Things I can understand. Your sister talks about campaigns and market research, concepts I can follow. But when you talked about applications and software development, it felt like a foreign language. So instead of learning the language, I said, you decided it wasn't worth speaking. Dad winced. That's not fair. Isn't it? You built Thompson Manufacturing from nothing. You learned about metallurgy, supply chain management, government contracting, employee management, dozens of skills you didn't start with. But when your son chose a career in technology, you decided that was too complicated to understand? We sat in silence while my words settled. Finally, Dad spoke again. You're right. I was scared of looking stupid, so I dismissed it instead. That was wrong. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was more self-awareness than I'd expected. The proposal you presented, he said, it's exactly what we need. Patricia ran the numbers, and Steve is convinced it'll solve most of our operational headaches. The board wants to move forward. But, I could hear the hesitation in his voice. But I need to know this won't be weird, working with my daughter, I mean. Can we keep the business separate from the family stuff? I almost laughed. Dad, I've been keeping business separate from my family for 3 years. The question is whether you can do the same. Over the next 6 weeks, NextFlow implemented the complete digital transformation system at Thompson Manufacturing. I worked directly with Uncle Steve and their operations team, while Dad maintained professional distance. It was strange at first, being in the same building as my father but interacting as CEO to client rather than son to father. But the results were undeniable. Within a month, Their inventory accuracy improved from 67% to 94%. Their supplier ordering became automated and predictive, eliminating the chronic overstocking that had been tying up capital. Their customer communications became transparent and professional, leading to 3 new contract wins in the first quarter. By March, Thompson Manufacturing had recovered their initial investment and was on track to save over $200,000 in the first year. Dad stopped referring to my work as computer stuff and started asking technical questions about system capabilities and future enhancements. The real transformation, though, happened at Easter dinner. For the first time in 4 years, I accepted Mom's invitation to a family gathering. Not because I needed their approval anymore, but because I was curious to see how the dynamic had shifted. Derek was there with his usual stories about legal victories. Jessica talked about her latest marketing campaigns. But when attention turned to me, something different happened. Marcus just finished implementing a complete digital transformation for a manufacturing company, Dad said, his voice carrying a note of pride I hadn't heard in years. Increased their efficiency by 38% and saved them $180,000 in operational costs. Derek looked surprised. That's impressive. What kind of software? For the first time in my adult life, I explained my work to my family while they listened with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. I talked about inventory optimization, supply chain management, and customer relationship systems. They asked follow-up questions. They wanted to understand not just what I did, but how it created value for clients. So you're basically like a business consultant, Jessica said, except instead of making recommendations, you build tools that automatically implement the solutions. Exactly. The software doesn't just identify problems, it prevents them. Dad nodded approvingly. That's smart business. After dinner, as I was getting ready to leave, Dad pulled me aside. I owe you an apology, he said. Not just for the barbecue comment, but for years of not taking your work seriously. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I appreciate that, I replied. But I don't need you to understand my work to respect it, I just need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. He smiled. Not the patronizing smile I remembered from childhood, but the genuine smile of someone who had finally seen me clearly. Trust me, he said. After what you've done for my company, I know exactly what you're doing. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how completely the narrative had shifted. 6 months earlier, I was the family disappointment who wasted space at gatherings. Now I was the successful entrepreneur who had saved the family business. But the most important change wasn't in how they saw me, it was in how I saw myself. I'd stopped needing their validation to know my worth. I'd stopped defining success by their narrow criteria. I'd built something valuable on my own terms, and their eventual recognition was just a nice bonus. The real victory wasn't that my startup had the opportunity to work with Dad's company. The real victory was that I no longer needed that opportunity to feel successful. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving your critics wrong, it's building something so undeniably valuable that their opinions become irrelevant. And sometimes, if you're lucky, those critics become your biggest supporters. Not because you changed, but because they finally learned how to see what was there all along. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.